Hello, Winchester readers, and those of you who've joined us this evening from out of town as well. We're very excited to be opening the evening for our 10th annual Winchester Reads celebration. This all started with an idea by Kathy Richardson on our committee, who came to Linda Wills and then Sandy Thompson 10 years ago to say, why don't we start a community read in Winchester? And the idea evolved, and now 10 years later, here we are again. In those 10 years' time, we have read Sea Folks by Paul Fleischman, To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee, Mountains Beyond Mountains, and we had Tracy Kidder here in this auditorium, The Kite Runner by Husseini, In Revere in Those Days, Roland Murillo, and he came here. Three Cups of Tea by Greg Mortensen. There's a story there. Run with Ann Patchett, and she joined us here as well as Greg Mortensen. And then we had Song Yet Sung by Bill McBride. And last year we welcomed Andrew Bridge, who talked about Hope's Boy. And you will hear more about our lovely author this evening. I just wanted to highlight again those people who have made this volunteer organization happen so well every year. Dee Dee Gallagher, who is an employee at Bookends, yay, has been the coordinator for the last, I think, 7 or 8 years. We have Kathy Richardson, who got the whole ball rolling, Barbara Yuan Austin, also from the library. Also volunteers Rosemary Sullivan, Jerry Driscoll, Fran McClintock, Connie Stolo, Joni O'Neill, and Sandy Thompson also we thank for her input and her promoting this program. One of the mission statement of our program is the book chosen has to be of a manageable length, one that can be shared across the community, promote the understanding of ourselves, others, and the world, be relevant to the world today, and lend itself to a discussion and a culminating event. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've done it again. My final act up here tonight is to introduce the introducer. And we have the eminent Mr. John Sullivan. John is the executor of the Mary and John Murphy Educational Foundation. And in 2003, they came forward with supporting this townwide activity and have graciously continued to fund this opportunity for us to bring these amazing authors and activists to our stage. So with that in mind, I don't think I have to introduce John, everybody knows him, but we're so pleased that he's here to take us to the next step.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be asked to come down here. As the previous speaker just said, I had an opportunity to learn about this organization 10 years ago as one of the people who runs the John and Mary Murphy Foundation, Educational Foundation, which is a story about Winchester all on its own. John and Mary Murphy lived up in the Richardson Street in the east side. They came down to me back maybe 12 years ago and asked me to do their will. And I did it, and they wanted to leave their money, which we never did find out how much it would be. So whatever their money, they had no relatives, they wanted to leave it for a purpose of education of Winchester residents, not only children, but adults. And so we agreed to do it, my partner and I, Pat Hall. And one of the first requests we got from a grant was from your organization, and we thought it really might set the tone for our own endeavors. And to our surprise, just so I don't think I've ever said this publicly, but it's public information, when we read the will and realized ahead of time, but we had no idea how much money it was, we guessed it might be $30,000 or $40,000. It turned out they, in addition to their house on Richardson Street, they had $3.6 million, which all of it went to the John and Mary Murphy Foundation. We decided the day we found that out that we would not charge for our services in running the foundation, and we never have, with the exception of paying an accountant to do the income tax every year. One of the first donations we made was to this, and we're very proud of that. And I'd like to just tell you that we started with $3.6 million, and over the last 10 years, we've given out $2.2 million in the town of Winchester. And we still have 2.8 million. So, and I wish it was mine. Well, it's a real honor, and I just an honor to John and Mary Murphy to have an opportunity to come here. It's an honor to introduce this special guest who I just spent the last 2 hours with, and she's not only a great writer, but a most interesting and charming person. Her name is Marina Endicott. Marina is a Canadian novelist and a short story writer. In 2009, Marina won the 2009 Commonwealth of Canada Writers' Prize, which is a national competition in Canada. The book is our book, Good to a Fault. Marina grew up in Nova Scotia, Toronto, and Ontario. She grew up, she was educated in both poor and very affluent schools. And when you think of the book, those that have read it, you see the collision between classes of different types of people, the poor and sometimes the wealthy. After she finished high school, she went to Waterloo University. The story is she was supposed to go to Yale, but when she found out there was no acting degree at Yale, she went to Waterloo, and she graduated in 1980. After graduation, she went to work as an actress, and then began to write fiction and poetry. She moved to England in 1982 with two friends to take London by storm as actors. And I said, you mean actresses? And she said to me tonight, no, actors. We're like doctors. That's the professional name, whether you're a male or a female, and we are actors. And they didn't have much luck taking London by storm, and so she moved back in 1982, and returning to work as a director of the Saskatchewan Playwrights Center. Then she married a gentleman by the name of Peter Omshaw, who was a poet, and surprisingly a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They have two children, Will, 1993, and Rachel, 1996. In the back of the book that I had, Good to a Fault, there was a write-up about her, which I don't know if you had the same book that I did, but if you read that as well as the story, she summarizes her values in life. She has about 7 or 8 of them. And a few of them are, one of the values is about reading. One of the values is about writing. One is a value about motherhood. One is the value of home, and about the collision of the classes, the poor versus the wealthy. When you read Good to a Fault, if you had read that value section like I did before I read the book, it seemed that every one of her values were built in to something that happened in that story, either an individual or some event that happened. She had a list of quotes in there too, and I'll leave you with this one on the values associated with writing. She says, quote, "Plays are for money." She was an actress and a playwright. "Poetry is temporary." She did that briefly. "Novels are the world." And at this time, ladies and gentlemen, to talk about the world, I'd like to introduce Marina Endicott.
Thank you, John. I have been writing fiction for some time. I think I'll probably go on with that. It's the best small description of what writers do that I've ever heard. I may steal it, actually, but I'll always credit you. I'm just going to pour my water because I've been traveling for too long and I've got a very hoarse throat. Also, I almost missed my plane today because they changed the gate on me. And I have a horror of missing planes, and I'd been there 2.5 hours early because I really like to just be calm. I get there really well in time, not this off stage, and then I can park and read and think. And I did all that, having checked that I was at the right gate, and then they changed the gate on me anyway, and I didn't find out until I thought, boy, I think we should be loading, it's 10:02. So I ran about 1.5 miles this morning, in a panic. This is my first visit to the United States with this publication. I'm really delighted to be here in Winchester. Thank you very much for inviting me. I know the area well because my brother and sister went to school at Harvard, and I used to come down here every chance I got, having by then realized my grave error in not going to Yale. So I had a vicarious life down here, and I really liked it. And I keep thinking one of these days I'll come back. Thank you to the committee, too, for a wonderful dinner. I went to the wonderful Chinese Sky, had a great time. And thank you also, those of you who have read the book. It's wonderful to talk to people who have already read it, who I don't have to explain the plot to or avoid spoilers. If you haven't read it, just look intelligent and unsurprised, and no one will know. I think I'm going to read to you first a little bit, and then talk, and then read, and then talk a lot more. And if there's time at the end, I will take requests in case you'd like to hear a little bit of Mrs. Pell that you'd like to hear in person. I get a lot of requests for Mrs. Pell. I want to start by jumping into the difficult beginning of relationships and how these strange things happen to us, where one moment we are walking on the street and the next minute we've met the people that we're going to be spending a lot of our life with. If you look back on how you met your husband or your wife, you may find that it's similar. Sometimes even involves being knocked down. I have a friend who met her husband when he knocked her down with his bike. This book is set in Saskatoon, which I'm sure you know by now because it's such a world-famous city. Is a small northern town in Saskatchewan, which is the middle of the Prairie provinces, the one that has straight lines on either side. It is a town of about 180,000, so it's not tiny. It's big enough to encompass a range of classes and a range of neighborhoods. One of the things we don't talk about is class, and another one is money, and I wanted to just start here with chapter 4, which is counting money. I don't know why we don't talk about it, since it concerns us all so deeply, and many of us spend so many nights wide-eyed thinking about it as we stare at the ceiling. Or maybe that's just writers, maybe ordinary citizens don't have to. So here's the beginning and how we get ourselves into these messes, counting money. Clara's already in the mess, and Lorraine's already in the hospital in her own mess. At 10 that night, Clara went back through the hospital to Lorraine's silent room. The window was a dark rectangle in the white wall. Clara turned off the overhead fluorescent light and left on the small yellow bulb over the sink, pulling the alcove curtain part way around so it wouldn't glare on Lorraine's eyes. Now they could see the lights of the city across the river and the pretty bridges and the night sky. Deep shadowy blue, not black even so late. I'm worried about the kids, Lorraine said. Easier to talk in the darkness. I'm worried about Clayton too, but not as much. He can take care of himself, more or less. Now would be the time for Clara to mention Clayton having left. But Lorraine said, I'm afraid. All Clara could think of was, don't be. An unforgivable, asinine thing to say. She did not want to remember her father dying or the horrors her mother went through. I'm sorry. Of course you're afraid. I guess I mean, don't let superstition trap you into pretending to be positive all the time. There's no jinxing. Being blindly optimistic doesn't help. What does help then? I pray, but it does not always. She could think of no word but suffice, which would sound pompous. It's hard to know what to pray for. Lorraine snorted and flapped her hands onto the sheet. I know what to pray for, that this my thing will go away, that I'll have my kids back with me, that everything will go on the way it was the day before we came to Saskatoon, when I was worrying about how to find work and a place to live, not how to live. It was not a tirade, but a considered statement. I had enough worry before. I'm not going to worry now. I'm not going to pray either. I'm going to be patient and wait for this to happen. She corrected herself. Wait for this to go away. There were blue marks under her eyes and her skin was puffy, the steroids affecting her already. If her fever could be brought down, they were assessing her for chemo in the morning. And then would come a bad time, Clara knew. For a moment, she was glad she had been with her mother during that long struggle, so she knew a little bit about it to be able to help Lorraine. Is there anything you like to read? Magazines? People? Something more serious while you've got some time? Some of each, Lorraine said. Her pointy smile was very tired. One more thing, though. I don't know what to do about Darlene, Clara said. She wants to see you, of course. Should I put her off or bring her in? Don't bring Trevor. Not right now, but you could bring Darlene. I need her to get some stuff from the car now that I think of it. Good thing you said. Clara had forgotten their car in the impound lot. They gave us the knapsacks and I have the children's things. Yeah, but I got some stuff hidden in there in the Dart. We were living in there for the last couple of weeks. You know how it is. You have to keep your stuff somewhere. From her tone, Clara supposed it was money or even drugs. She would not be a good judge of that. Maybe papers, that kind of treasure. I'll bring Darlene tomorrow. I meant to ask if there's anyone I should call for you. I'm not sure if Clayton has had a chance to do that. Nice way of putting it, Lorraine said. No, there's no one. Not that I know where they are anyways. This time Clara stopped herself from saying she was sorry and decided again not to get into Clayton's absence. You look like you could sleep, she said. I'll bring books tomorrow. Yeah, Lorraine said. I'll catch up on that summer reading I've been meaning to get to. Don't bring Pierce. That would be hard on him. All right, Clara said. I'll keep him at home. He's good. He's doing well. Thank you. Lorraine closed her eyes and turned her head away from Clara before she opened them again. The window looked out on all the lights across the river, a million glinting sparks. And a little later, Lorraine lay in bed counting money. $77 in the glove compartment. Lucky sevens. 3 20s, a 10, a 5. The $2 bill saved for years. Whore's money, Clayton would call that. Not loose for anyone to find, meaning Clayton, of course, but stuck between the back 2 pages of the map book. They were not going to get to Newfoundland or Labrador. $189 left in the bank, but she thought Clayton probably had her bank card, and he knew her PIN. $100. One $100 bill hidden, taped inside a box of tampons in the cardboard box in the trunk. Clayton would not have found that, but the worry was that somebody might throw out the box. She could hardly stand to think about money. What would Clayton do? He had $300 and some left on the Husky gas card before it maxed out, but no car, so gas wasn't going to do him good. They could eat, though, at Husky Station restaurants. If he decided to take the kids on to Fort McMurray, which she wondered if he was planning on doing, since he was obviously not at Clara's anymore. 189, 300, how long would that last? At a certain point in all this figuring, Lorraine would feel her neck stiffen and swell from tension, and she'd fling the whole thing out of her mind. She lay still, mostly. Moving made her feel weird. And whatever drugs she was pumped full of seemed to make it easier to lie still. If things were ordinary, she'd be in the car. Pierce nestled in her elbow and worrying about money and thinking ahead to what work she could get in Fort McMurray. Worrying about who would look after the kids while she waitressed or cleaned houses again. About gas and how much a bunch of bananas and some fig Newtons had taken out of the purse. She moved her feet under the pale green sheet and stared with torn open eyes around the room. Here she was. The moon made bars of yellow light that gradually drifted across the room. She could tell she must have slept when she saw the moonlight farther advanced on the sheets, on the end of the bed, on the wall. The moon rose in the east and set in the west just like the sun, sometimes with the sun. She had sat nursing Pierce in the car while the others ate outside in the sun at Taco Bell last week. His mouth pulling and pulling and his eyes staring at her in a trance of happiness, and the white moon visible in the night sky and the blue day sky. She could not die on them. $77, $189, $300. It took her a few minutes to work it out in her foggy head. 366. Well, that was a lucky number. She liked 3s and 6s. Clayton couldn't feed them all on that for long. They'd be at the food bank. Mum Pell had money somewhere, but she wouldn't give it up for food, least of all for the kids. Lorraine let herself hate Mum Pell for the cherries she insisted on buying, that huge $6 bag of BC cherries that had probably caused the whole thing anyways, making Clayton drive too fast to make up for stopping, and bits of red pulp clinging to everything after the crash, like your own body and brains turned inside out, like one of the children had been badly hurt. Lorraine's chest ached, the breasts and the inside too, with wanting to have Pierce and the others with her. She was filled with panicky rage, just thinking about Clay and Mum Pell. But the children were so sweet, except there was no money. 77, 89, 100. How long did it take for welfare to kick in last time? But they weren't residents of Saskatchewan. They'd get sent back to Winnipeg on the bus. They couldn't leave her, though. She was entitled to health care anywhere in Canada, they were always saying. They needed $1,200. $6 for an apartment, another $6 for the damage deposit, first and last month's rent. Who knew how long it would take for Clayton to get paid for anything, no matter how fast he found a job? There was no way. They'd be in housing. They'd be in a shelter. Clayton would not be good at looking after the kids on his own in a shelter, and Mum Pell was worse than useless. She would have to talk to the kids. They'd need some kind of, the thought of a weapon for them, a nail file, a pin. Lorraine sat up and vomited neatly into a green plastic kidney basin. She lay down again. It might all be a dream. The moon had floated off, leaving the room dark and deserted. In a while, she slept. Ooh, I haven't read that for a long time. I forgot how much she thinks about money, as would anybody in her situation. This book began in 2001 with a commission. The actual physical writing of the book began in 2001 with a commission from our national radio, sort of like NPR. Thanks to Bonnie Bernard, who wrote A Good House, some of you might have read, who had asked for me. They commissioned me to write a short piece, and they offered to pay me $500, and I needed it so badly that there was no question of saying no, but I didn't have anything. And so I sat there in my basement concrete room where I was writing, just trying to think of something, and a scene recurred to me maybe 14 or 15 years before. I had been walking down the street in Saskatoon, and I had watched a small collision happen in an intersection near my work, where a tidy little K car was going through the intersection. K cars were those old ones that were quite sedate looking. And as it was going through the intersection, a terrible old beater came racing through from the other side. The K car was turning left and the beater was coming through, and they collided. It wasn't really much of a collision, no huge bang, no steam coming out of the car or glass breaking. The tidy woman got out of the tidy car. She had her insurance and her registration in one hand and was quite apologetic. And the other car, all the windows and doors burst open, and everybody's rushed out, shrieking and swearing, and crying, and it was like there was 12 or 15 people got out of that car. And it was like the pavement had opened up and had cracked down the middle and hell had hopped up. And even standing there at that moment, I thought how that tidy little woman's life had changed entirely. And so I decided to write the short story about what would actually happen there. Standing on the street, watching that collision, I did not think one day I'll be in Winchester talking about this. And I don't know what happened to the woman. Although in Saskatoon it could quite have easily been somebody I knew. So that collision and that short story became the first 2 chapters of Good to a Fall, where I just imagined what would happen with the people in the car and the woman when they went to the hospital and what might happen next. The short story ended with, at the end of, I think it's chapter 4, 5, or 3 or 4, where Clara, as she is then, is holding the baby, and she realizes that Clayton's left, and she says, holding the baby, mine. And it was a great radio ending, you know, because it sort of changed everything and made you think back and kind of ripple backwards, kind of like, Luke, I am your father. Makes you think back all the way through the 2 movies and you go, oh wow, she wanted that baby all along. So it was a really good radio ending. But it reminded me of the time I was at my brother's wedding and we're all lined up to take the photos and I was standing beside him and I went like this, behind his head, for a second, just like that. That's all. But of course that was the photo that ended up getting blown up and given to everybody, and they never forgave me for having given him rabbit ears. And he got divorced, so it was probably all my fault. It just seemed unfair to have ended the story there. It seemed like that was not really what was going on. She did not take them in because she wanted that baby. Certainly she didn't do it consciously. And even if that was part of it, it was not all of it. And so it always nagged at me that I had been unfair to Clara and I wanted to go back. And so I did go back and keep thinking about what really would have happened and what the real consequences would have been of doing such a rash thing and taking on a family who weren't your own. I thought I would tell you about where some of the characters come from. I forgot that you had that wonderful US book that has the stuff in the back of it. So some of the things I was going to tell you are actually in the back of the book, and I'll skip them in my text. But one thing I don't talk about in there is some of the models for people. For example, Mrs. Zenko, who you might think is a little bit of an idealized version of a next-door neighbor, but when my husband read the book, he said, "Are you allowed to put my mother in a book like that?" Because that is my mother-in-law. She is also Ukrainian and also the most generous person, and not heavily generous, you know, just lightly generous, just hops over with the cake you need or with the high chair that she doesn't really need anymore, but you can use it. There's nothing that Mrs. Zenko does in the book that my mother-in-law hasn't actually done in real life. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's Mrs. Pell. It's hard to imagine her bringing somebody a high chair or doing anything but stealing from them. But Mrs. Pell too had a real root in reality. When my husband first went into the Mounties, which is the classic Canadian police force in the red serge jacket and the Boy Scout hat, that's only their dress uniform. They look like normal state troopers most of the time. When he first went there, I went with him, and there was absolutely nothing for me to do. I had worked in the theater before, and oddly enough, there were no theaters in this town of 200 people that we got sent to in northern Alberta. You'd think they'd have a couple of theaters, but no. And so I was searching for work and taking anything I got, and some logging company hired me to do a long autobiography of a woman who had been living on their land. The logging and oil company had bought her land but left her living there, and they wanted her off because they now wanted to dig under her house. And the deal that she struck with them was that they would put her into a very fancy old folks home. I've never seen anything like it. And that she would have an autobiography published that she would write and dictate to somebody. So they hired me. She was a canny old lady. So Myrtle Matson I think we had 12 sessions together where she told me her life story, and it was only about session 3 that I realized that she was telling me lies. I just thought she was, interesting pioneer stories, but no, she was just making stuff up like crazy. In fact, there's the English publication of the book is Windmill Publishers in England, and they asked me for an outtake, and there's a Mrs. Pell story on that website that you can search for that is actually part of the story that Myrtle Matson told me about a snake. Pretty good story, but all lies. But I actually liked Myrtle Matson in a certain way, and I also thought, I think when I'm old, I'll be Mrs. Pell. I think I'll keep a box of donuts under the bed and be really selfish and be tired and no longer interested in putting up with stuff. When I began to write her, I of course was thinking her as an awful, really appalling person. But as insidiously happens when you write a fiction, you begin to see them as human beings, and so I began to see Mrs. Pell too as a human being who I loved and felt sorry for and wished she hadn't had such a horrible life, even though she's really a ghastly old bird. Darwin had many originators, many examples. I know a lot of people like Darwin who are kind of temporary help. They swan in when you need them and then they're gone, and the one thing you can't rely on them for is to stay. But they will come and help you, not unlike God, who seems to come when you need him, but you can't seem to get him to pick up the groceries. And Dolly, where did Dolly come from? When I first started writing the book, I was worried that I was appropriating the story of homeless people living in their car, and I wondered, as a by then pretty middle-class person living in a nice suburban home in Cochrane, Alberta, how I dared to write about homeless people who were living in their car. And I'm not joking, this is true. It was about 2 years before I realized and remembered that when I was 6 years old, my mother got cancer. And we were then, my dad was an Episcopalian minister, and we lived in BC. We had to leave his parish. We had 4 children in our family at that point. We had to leave the parish and go to Vancouver for my mother to have a pretty extensive cancer treatment. And somehow through that really frightening time, my parents decided this was going to be a good opportunity for change. And so after all that summer of, real fear and whether she would survive or not, they packed us all up, and my father applied for graduate school in Halifax, and we went to Dalhousie. So we moved from Vancouver on one coast to Halifax on the other coast. They had no money. I don't know how they did it. I shudder to think what I couldn't even do with 2 children, and they had 4, and it was a long time ago. But we lived in the car, of course, as we were going along across Canada, and it seemed like a long journey to me. And my father had, after my mother had a mastectomy and very cobalt chemo, which was pretty radical, pretty strong, she went back to work as an OR nurse way too soon. My father got all kinds of jobs like Brinks truck driver and grocery store packer. So we had a very shattered kind of life for a little while there. So of course I was remembering my own 6-year-old self, but I somehow neglected to remind my 40-year-old self that that's what I was doing. So they drove across Canada with all of us in the car in order to start a better life, which is in effect what Lorraine and Clayton are trying to do when they go to Fort McMurray, where they know they can get work, and there's lots of work. It's very expensive to live, but they have that worked out, and they're in a less efficient and maybe less ambitious way trying to do exactly the same thing. We talk a lot about, in Canada at least, about region and about race. French and English is our usual conversation. Native people, white people is a part of the conversation. We have less of a race conversation than has been the case in the States for a while. But one of the things we don't really talk about much is class. And that may be because the divisions have become pretty fluid, at least for those of us who are vaguely middle class, which is a huge swath of us, and particularly the people who are writing and reading. As John said, in my last few years of high school, though, I went from a rural Nova Scotia high school, where my auditorium was exactly like this, to an inner city school in Toronto where there are shootings and murders all the time. And then, because that was a little bit too violent for my mother, she marched us all down and got us scholarships to the big fancy private schools, the most prestigious schools in Canada we went to. So for the last 2 years of high school, I was in with the elite. And I was a scholarship day girl, so it wasn't always an easy position to be in, but because we had uniforms, at least nobody knew necessarily. In all of those communities, however, the low and the high, I've been roaming around on the fringe of them, being poor or being well off. I was on welfare for one bad month in the 1980s. I haven't worked at cleaning houses, but that's only because nobody in their right mind would hire me. And typing always got me a job a little bit faster, but you know, I had family backing and I had education, and I also had that indefinable privilege of class where I was allowed to move back and forth because I knew which fork to use and I knew how to talk to people who didn't, and I could seem at home in many different places. I think for Lorraine and Clayton and their children, those divisions are not as flexible. The children change class, in effect, when they move in with Clary. And some of the suspense for me in the book is the problem of whether Dolly and Trevor, and eventually Pierce, will fall back down to the underclass when they go back to their own family. And how will they be comfortable with their own world? Will they be able to move back and forth, or will they somehow be lost in the cracks again? Like, I don't know if you know Hayao Miyazaki, who does a lot of anime for children, beautiful, beautiful movies. He has one movie called Totoro, which I watched over and over again with my kids when they were small. And in that really beautiful movie, the villain of the piece is illness. And that, I think, has bled into my work too, that there is no villain here except cancer, except the threat of poverty and destruction of the family. There's no person who's particularly bad. Even Clayton, although he acts badly, is not necessarily an evil person. We all have some experience of how cancer chews up families and spits us all out. In my case, my mother, when I was 6, she's just recently had a recurrence of breast cancer. 46 years later, that's pretty good going. And she's fine. She's had a lumpectomy, and she won't have to do any of the chemo or radiation, so that's another reprieve. My sister, my younger sister, developed cancer when she was 35, died when she was 36. And I, too, halfway through writing Good to a Fault, developed cancer. I'm fine. I had a hysterectomy and was perfectly okay. My husband said to me, next time write a book about a woman who wins the lottery. So I'm going to do that. My sister's illness and death was, of course, one of the sources for the novel. It was really strange and confusing to develop my own cancer when I was halfway through. But it was also, although I couldn't work on the book for about 6 months, not because I was too ill, but because I just couldn't stand to think about it. It was, of course, a real strong source for, it made the book much better, I believe. My understanding of Lorraine going through cancer had been entirely through Dolly's eyes, as myself as a 6-year-old thinking about my mother and whether she would die. And then I was given the gift of being able to see Dolly through Lorraine's eyes, a woman who has a child who she can't bear to leave, and she knows she must not. It altered the story, certainly because I didn't want Lorraine to die anymore. I had expected that she probably would, but it also altered the story because I was able to watch my daughter, who was then 7, going through the same panic stations as I had done when I was a child, but I could watch her. And I stole ruthlessly many of the things that she says. are straight from my daughter. I wanted to read you from the middle of the book now, where Lorraine is doing badly. You may remember that she has been allowed to come home for a little while, but after the brief visit home, she has a couple of bad nights and she's back in the hospital now. At this point, Darwin is helping and they know Paul. Leaving the hospital after a hard visit with a parishioner, Paul saw that it was raining and stopped to put on his windbreaker, hoping vaguely that he himself would be more willing to let go at 87. The zipper wouldn't do up. He should break down and buy a new jacket. He was conscious of added weight in the building, Lorraine back on the 5th floor again. In a room alone this time, never a good sign. Paul said a quick silent prayer for her, pushing away death. He was afraid to go up. That was the bare truth. Coward. At least he could stand in the hall and say hello. He turned and caught the elevator as the doors were closing and was raised up in one smooth swoop. Darwin was standing in the door of Lorraine's new room. "Hey man," Darwin said, "Lorraine will be glad to see you. I'll go down the hall for a while since you're here for a visit." He was not. He did not want to be. He had visited enough death today. He nodded and clasped Darwin's hand and went in. Lorraine was restless in the bed, her legs moving constantly beneath the sheets, but she held out her hand to him. "Hey," she said, "you didn't come round while I was home. I was expecting to see you." He said he was happy to have been expected and sorry not to have come. "Darwin's gone to get more ice," she said. "I like it." Paul nodded. He could see now that she was feverish and off kilter. "He's good to me," she said. "He's better than my husband. Poor Clay." He should be soothing her and comforting her, but she was going full tilt. "Clayton would be here if he knew, but nobody knows where he is, you know." Her eyes were bright and slightly unfocused. "Jesus, Mary and Joseph," she said. Her legs switched one side, the other side of the bed. "I knew I couldn't take it. There's no shame in knowing when you can't handle something. You know yourself the best. Nobody knows. Nobody can know for you. Clary thinks he stinks, but I still love him. I shove him. I glove him." Paul kept her hand in his, gripping back when she gripped his and releasing a little when she released. He said nothing, but gave her all his attention. "I have to watch him," she whispered, urgent to tell. "He will. He tried. He shook Piercy when he was... I stopped him. I stopped him in time, but it was rough. But it's only from time to time. When things get him going, I can manage him." She stared deep into Paul's eyes, needing something from him that he tried to give. Not absolution. He didn't think it was that. "They're his. They're mine. They're not hers." "No," he said. "They are your children. They know that." Maybe that was it. She lay back and her legs ceased their constant restless movement. She kept his hand, but then Darwin came in and she turned to him instead. "I know what I have to do," she said. I know how to do it." Darwin sat on the bed beside her and let his hand rest on her abdomen, spread wide and very still. "I know now," she said more calmly. "She's been straying this last couple of days," Darwin told Paul. "A bad night last night?" Paul nodded. "I thought. The nurse will be in pretty soon with some more serious stuff. I'll calm her down." Lorraine tried to sit up. "I've got to go." "No, sweetheart, you got to stay for a while," Darwin said. He slid her pillow into better comfort as he made her lie back. "I don't have to go," she said obediently. "Not right now." "Not now," he said, agreeable. Paul thought he would get a coffee before making his way home, but while he was still waiting in line, Darwin came down. "She's out. She'll be out for a while," he said. "I could give you a ride." Since Paul had walked over, he agreed. But Darwin turned right from the hospital grounds and drove across the bridge over the shining black water, the lights reflected in arch after arch of Shadow Bridge. His big, slow car slid down the streets to 21st and parked in front of the Senator Hotel. "I'm going to get some off sale. Clary doesn't have anything but her mom's old sherry in the house, and I could use a beer," he said. "I could too," Paul said. "Let's go in then. You pay any pool?" The hotel was crowded and hot on a Saturday night, and the music loud and a grey veil of smoke hanging 4 feet down from the blue styrofoam tile ceiling. Darwin got them a table by the wall, working his way through the jostling bodies, saying, Hey, Sheldon. Hi, Chris, as if this was his regular bar. Paul felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and panic. He had not been in this kind of bar since university, and he must look like a priest, he said to himself. He took off his jacket and rolled his sleeves up. Maybe he could look like an off-duty accountant if he tried. The girl leaned down to Darwin, but Paul couldn't hear what he said. In a few minutes she was back with a full tray, placing glass after glass on the table. 6 glasses of draft beer and 2 shot glasses overflowing with whiskey of some kind. Paul could feel a murmur working its way into voice, but he stifled it. A couple of beers weren't going to kill him. His sermon was already finished for once. The shot was Irish whiskey. It caught at the back of his throat and filled the whole upper half of his chest with a warm transfusion of relief. "She's delirious," Darwin shouted over the racket. "I thought, yes," Paul said, nodding his head many times in case Darwin couldn't hear him either. "It's some kind of reaction to her medication. They're not surprised." Paul was surprised that he could hear what Darwin was saying. The whiskey was helping. He drained one of the beers. 2 old men leaned down, palms on the table, talking to Darwin, frowsy fellows. They were surprised and pleased to see him. It'd been quite a while, and so on. They ignored Paul after a short nod, so he was free to stare around the room, what he could see of it in the haze. The noise seemed to be affecting his eyesight, too. At least a third of these people had to be older than himself. Women with caked, gluey makeup on and outfits revealing leathery bosoms and bony shoulders. Men with noses fallen off their original line, red-blotched skin. Those sets sat together in silence or argued, their talk spiked with jeering, wheezy laughs. Philosophizing tables of freshly returned university students, too young to be out. Some with goatees or strange sideburns. Eloquent hockey fans leaned towards each other across a large, long table, their faces broken and patched together, little girls with sharp eyes and soft mouths sitting beside them. More beer. These were small glasses, but the draught, although watery, was surprisingly delicious. "I like the taste of beer, its live white lather, its brass bright depth, the sudden whirl through the wet brown walls of the glass, the tilted rush to the lips, and the slow swallowing down to the lapping belly, the salt on the tongue, the foam at the corners." "What?" Darwin yelled through the arms of the old guys. "Sorry, nothing. It was Dylan Thomas talking about beer. I'm sorry." Paul waited to become furious with himself for quoting poetry out loud, but shame did not arrive. Instead, he felt quite happy to have remembered all that, and he began cudgeling his memory for more. Those famous last words, of course. "I've had 18 straight whiskies," he said. "I think that's the record." He was on a roll. Darwin's eyes shifted to him again, though the larger of the 2 men was telling him a long, convoluted story about a trailer and 2 dogs. "He said," Paul shouted, leaning forward, "he drank to reconcile the disorder outside and the order within himself." "Me too," Darwin said. "I drink to forget," Paul said. "Me too," Darwin said. "Lisanne." "Before we die of thirst," Darwin begged the waitress as she sailed by, her empty tray skied above helium fingertips. She gave him a huge, heartfelt smile, as women must always do for Darwin, Paul thought. She vanished, but only to serve them the faster. "I wish Clary was here," Paul said suddenly. Darwin drained his glass to the bottom before he nodded and put it down again. "Someone has to stay home with the babies," Paul said. Then he worried that Darwin might not realize he was joking. But the beautiful waitress came back with that beautiful 3-cornered, bountiful smile, and Darwin gave her a fat tip. But it wasn't Darwin's turn to tip her, it was Paul's turn, and so he tipped her too. There were beers and a couple more shots of Irish on the tray for them, and this time they clinked before knocking them back, and the Irish hit Paul in all the places in his throat that had been missing alcohol for too long. He needed a beer to go chasing after it, which is why they call it a chaser, like a hair of a dog that chases you. "I don't normally drink in the evening," he told Darwin. And Darwin nodded and agreed, and they were swept up in a group of people Darwin knew, who were going to the Pat, and wanted them to come too, so they drank up the beer and wandered in a straggling strand, a skein of loose knitting unraveling up the street to the Pat. A really low dive. Good thing they didn't have to drive, Paul was going to say to Darwin, because they probably should not have driven. But Darwin was far ahead, talking to some people who were laughing, and the 2 drunk university boys beside Paul wanted him to settle a question for them. How do we know we exist? Are our senses evidence enough? If we can touch a table, do we know that it is there? What is there? Paul laughed to be in such a conversation, and he bent his mind to explicating how we know what we know in a spume of eloquence that gave him enormous pleasure, riffing on the constantly shifting boundaries between tacit knowledge and focal knowledge, and how this boundary shift in itself is a tacit skill and is used to blend new information with old and even to create new extrapolated knowledge. We categorize the world in order to make sense of it, he told the boys, at least the closer boy, the one with the nose ring. And that gives us unconscious shortcuts. Knowledge is rooted in the tacit. Look at this sign, staring up at the ABJ All Makes Pawn Shop sign, gappy neon fizzing in the quieting night, is made up of small characters originally from the Phoenician. But are we ever aware of the alphabet? You don't have to think. You see the words and you know what they mean. How do you know English? You don't put conscious thought into how to speak. Phrases come already strung to the tongue. How do you know how to sing? You just sing. The smaller boy had the bar door held open by the big brass handle, and it looked too heavy for him. Paul hurried the other boy inside. But this is epistemology, and I am on steadier ground with ethics. He stopped the boys before he told them that he was an Anglican priest, because he suddenly found that he was no longer certain whether he was pretending to be slightly drunk to humor them or whether he had slipped ahead of them and was actually drunk. It was like Kelly, what's-his-name, from At Swim Two Birds, listening to the little man discoursing on Rousseau, and Kelly then made a low noise and opened his mouth and covered the small man from shoulder to knee with a coating of unpleasant buff-coloured puke. Many other things happened on that night, now imperfectly recorded in my memory, but that incident is still very clear to me in my mind. Where he had been when reading that was still very clear to Paul in his mind, sitting on the windowsill at Trinity, perhaps the year before he met Lisanne, perhaps the same year, but before. When buff-coloured puke and Rousseau and an addiction to language had seemed all part of one package that he would be untying all his life. Naturally, a wife changes you. As I changed her, Paul thought. He could feel tears coming like blisters, like cold sores ready to sport. He opened his eyes wider and forged away through the crowd to Darwin to bid him good night before setting off on the long walk home. But Darwin reached out a long arm and clawed Paul in beside him to listen to what this guy was saying, and there was another conversation just as fascinating as the tacit knowledge one, this one about some kind of spiritual awakening the guy had had while out all night on a skidoo trip, lost in the wilderness and the moon a pumpkin to save him. You never know who's going to tell you the good story, Darwin said. Wherever you go, there's your teacher. Paul was thunderstruck by the rightness of that. The music was louder than before. Someone was playing Rock Lobster. How long had it been since he had heard Rock Lobster? It must be either too long or not long enough. The halls of Trinity came back again. He was old and maudlin and washed in nostalgia, showing off for the boys. He sank into another trance, watching crazy people gyrating and flailing on the tiny dance floor. Darwin nudged him to go dance, but he was only plastered, not insane. He leaned against the pillar behind him and watched the dancers' shifting, sharding colors. It seemed they were all waving scarves, but those were just their arms. When I began the book, I thought Lorraine would die quite early on. That was my kind of plan. I thought, and then we'll see what happens with those children then. But I couldn't seem to kill her. It was a great relief to me when I finally realized how much more difficult it would be for everyone if she survived. I want to read you when Clary first realizes that that's going to happen. Clary hardly ever visited the hospital these days. Since Clayton was around again and clearly didn't want her there, she was busy with planning and managing, and it was even hard to fit Paul in. And she suddenly couldn't stand it at the hospital. Instead, she let all her energy go into the children in the new school term. Things were busier than ever with school and dentist and field trips and getting some order back into the house after the Christmas chaos. There was a lot to arrange. The children should be taking lessons. The piano was just sitting there, and Trevor really needed to start at Kumon if he was going to keep up, but Clayton was so resistant she hadn't brought that up again. She'd wait for a while. There was Dolly's museum trip to help plan too, and Clayton never showed any initiative. Even when she asked his opinion whether the children should take piano lessons or join the church choir, he seemed peevishly content to let her see to everything and pay for everything. His surly whip-dog arrogance was beginning to irritate her. And if Lorraine was getting better, then there were arrangements to work out at the house. Clary was working out what would be best for them. They could have the basement bedroom now that Darwin had gone west, but she'd have to find a double bed. Maybe it would be better to put them in the TV room upstairs, closer to the bathroom. That would be better. Only there wouldn't be enough room for Pierce's crib in there. He'd have to stay in her room. She'd think about it later when all those Valentines were done. The days seemed to be speeded up. Time was moving like electricity, the meter hands whirring around, ticking away money and energy and life. On Tuesday, Clary went into the hospital in the afternoon because Lorraine had left a message asking to see her. She left the children at home with Mrs. Pell in case Lorraine needed help with anything complicated. She thought she had the wrong room. Lorraine was not there. The bed was stripped. But they were saying she was doing well. She could not be... Not dead. No, she was in the washroom, the door slightly open, brushing her teeth, wearing clothes. "Lorraine," Clary said, her voice weirdly ordinary. "Are you all right?" Lorraine spat into the sink and rinsed and stood up. She dried her toothbrush with a white hospital washcloth and put it in her toilet bag. "I'm good," she said. "I'm really good." Clary stood in the middle of the room. The other bed was empty too. What had happened to that poor woman? Lorraine said, "They say I can go home." Clary did not speak for a second. Then she shook her head and smiled and shrugged her shoulders. "Wonderful," she said. "Yes, so I'm going." "Well, of course. Clayton's got us a place. We're going to go over there this afternoon." That did not make sense. Clary's chest was tight. Lorraine went to the closet and added her toilet bag to the already packed suitcase. "Seems pretty amazing to be getting out of here," she said. She moved a pile of magazines from the closet to the bed. "But Lorraine," Clary said. Then she didn't know how to continue. All of her bones moved downward, as if in deeper gravity. "He's gone to get Dolly from school, and he'll get them packed up, but I wanted to tell you about it alone," Lorraine said. She was carefully meeting Clary's eyes every step of the way, every word she said, not shying away from it, even though it would be bad. Clary looked like she'd been punched, but hadn't figured out that had happened yet. Lorraine thought her own face must have looked like that her first day in there. "Does Darwin?" Clary was speaking too slowly. "He phoned last night from Vancouver. I told him they'd be letting me go home." "Did he say?" "He said to give you a kiss from him." Lorraine did not move, but Clary flinched anyway. "So, Clary, I have to say thanks for everything," Lorraine said. "There isn't any way to thank you for looking after my kids all this time, but I know I owe you big time." Inside the hollow globe of her head, Clary was unable to figure all this out. She fought the pressure in her chest. She stood up straight, making more room for air. Clayton has a place, not the room." "It's okay," he says. "It's an older building, but they're renovating, and our suite is already done. He'll be the part-time super, so there's a little money in it. Looks like a good deal." "Where?" Lorraine stopped talking. Clary asked again, "Where is the apartment?" Lorraine looked at her without smiling. "They are our kids." "Well, I realize that." Her legs were shaking. "I realize that, but if you are planning to move them out of the school district, they would have to transfer, and which school would they be?" "It's in City Park," Lorraine said. "It's not a bad place. It's an older building, a little run down, but it's what we can afford, and the kids will be fine." "You're not ready, though. This is impossible. You can't look after children in this state, and Clayton, you think he can manage them?" That was enough for Lorraine. "You can't stop thinking about us as low class. You can't stop," she said. "You keep thinking you're better than me, even though you try not to. It's built into your whole life. But we're the same as you. We're just the same." Clary felt hot tears welling up like tears of blood. To be accused of prejudice when she had worked so hard. How could Lorraine think so? She would think so with her trailer park ignorance. Shocked, Clary smacked the thought away, but it was there. Less worthy, less human. Lorraine said, "Here's the difference between us. You got taken to the dentist more, and your mother filled your head with stuck-up shit about how great you are, and you got to live in the same house all your life. That's most of it. You went to school for longer, and you worked in a clean office instead of cleaning the office. You have a better-looking face and better-looking clothes, and that gives you some idea that you're better than me." I don't. You're mistaken. I'm trying to tell you how it is for me," Lorraine said. "Here it is. It's the same as it is for you. Her eyes were hard to look at. When you're hurting because you have to lose Pierce, that means you know exactly how I hurt to lose him. I don't have less feelings because I don't know the words to say them. I don't have less to say to my kids because it's not always. She shook her head. It's not just grammar. You think I'm not as good for them as you are. You're right, Clary said sadly. The tears had receded in the hot blood behind them. It was too important. It was the children. She could not be silent or polite. Now was the only time to say it. It's not you. It's Clayton. I think it will be hard for him to look after you well enough. Still polite after all. Well, he gets to give it a try, Lorraine said, not angry anymore. She gathered her paintbrushes from the water cup and set things in place in the paint box. He was doing okay till you crashed into us. That was the first time she'd mentioned the accident since it happened. She had not blamed Clary for it then. But what will happen to you if things get hard, if you run out of money? You can't work, you have to be careful. You can't leave the hospital behind or head for Fort McMurray. And the children, they need stability and their ordinary life, not to be shunted around the country living from hand to mouth. We are their ordinary life, not you, Lorraine said. She stopped, the cup still in her hand, and looked straight at Clary, piercing her with the stern arrows of her eyes. The kids don't give a rat's ass whether they have money or a nice house. They just want me and Clayton with them. They love us. Him too, not just me. Don't kid yourself. You're a babysitter to them. They'll be glad to leave you. Clary didn't speak. She was having trouble with her ribs, like a stitch. They didn't seem to want to expand to let her breathe. It's not your fault you don't get it, Lorraine said, with red smears of rouge bright on her cheeks. You never had kids of your own, and you weren't very well brought up. That was it. Clary turned and left the room. She drove out of the parking lot crying, tears splashing on the steering wheel, on her skirt, running down her face, into her collar, wetting her chest, which still wouldn't open to let her catch her breath. Her feet were clumsy on the clutch and the brake. Without meaning to go there, she found herself at Paul's house. She stood on the porch, trembling, pressing the doorbell. He was not going to answer. He would not be there. He opened the door. He saw her distress and took her hand, her arm, pulled her inside. What is it? He said. She could not answer. She could barely breathe. Clary, tell me, is it Lorraine? She sobbed, nodding, not intelligible. Yes, she sobbed. Yes, it is Lorraine. Is she what? Has she died? No, she has not. I was wondering before I started it, and I'm still wondering really, if the religion that our parents gave us meets our needs still, or if we have to rethink and think freshly. If we have to think rather than reciting by rote those comforting prayers that we grew up with. I think about that question as a kind of a lapsed Episcopalian who is attempting in various ways to be some kind of an approaching Buddhist, writing about someone who's trying to be a good Episcopalian, or about Paul, who I believe is a very faithful and good priest. One thing I've learned about Buddhism is that you can't learn about it by reading about it. In my reading, I've learned that. It's the doing that Good to a Fault is about, that the people's lives are about. How hard it is to get from our religious principles, from reading Shunryu Suzuki, to actually sitting on a cushion, meditating, to being loving to the dry cleaner. You know, Clary reads the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh. She has this large stack of advice and self-improvement and religious books that's sitting on her bedside table, and once she gets involved with the children, she takes them all out to the garage because she's got more things to do than to read, and she throws them out in the end. When I was a child, I had a nicely illustrated book which my mother loved, called If Jesus Came to My House, where Jesus comes over to the little girl's house and he has lunch and they walk around the yard and they do stuff. He pushes her on the swing. It's really foolish, really pretty illustrations. But late in the writing process of Good to a Fault, I thought, oh my God, I have rewritten If Jesus Came to My House. To what effect, I'm not quite sure. To a questioning effect, I guess. I'm thinking in Ascension, that last river scene where they go to the river and have a picnic, about how the world speaks to us sometimes in birds and signs and omens, and about why people have a religious sense, whether or not it's directed in any particular religion or sect. How the world consoles us and shines at us with what seems like meaning, whether there is meaning, like there is for Paul, or whether there is not much meaning, as there is for Lorraine. In honor of having the pleasure of reading people who've already read the ending, I just wanted to read a few paragraphs of the end. And then I'll open it to questions, so think up your questions. Darwin was digging in brown paper grocery bags, and he called Dolly to help him hand out paper plates of sandwiches. Plate after plate of crustless tuna and salmon sandwiches cut in triangles. Mrs. Pell said she didn't like fish and took her chair out to the willow grove in the middle of the island, where she fell asleep with her hat on. Clary bit into a tuna sandwich with parsley around the cut edges, wondering if Darwin might have stolen them from somewhere. Perhaps the United Church come-and-go tea for Edith and Willard Stepney's 75th anniversary, for example, which she ought to take Mrs. Zenko to that evening. The Stepneys had owned the store between her father's hardware store and John Zenko's jewelry store. They'd been old even then. The window of time when you could do anything was so brief, Clary thought. The Stepneys had probably had all kinds of ideas of what they would accomplish, not including spending the last 20 years sleepwalking in the seniors' lodge. Good sandwiches. Darwin was laughing at her again. She screwed up her nose and had another, salmon this time. I have half a mango here somewhere, Darwin said, rummaging through the supplies again. He hauled out a large bag of fruit of every kind, each one perfect. Dolly washed them at the water's edge and brought an orange to Lorraine and a ripe, medieval perfumed pear to Clary. The orange sprayed a smarting arc when Lorraine bit into it to start peeling. Orange and pear mixed with fire smoke, wound and twined with the wind in her hair. The children wandered along the shoreline eating sandwiches. Mrs. Zenko and Pierce walked more slowly, bringing treasures back to show Lorraine and Clary as they sat chatting carefully about nothing much, the heat and school and how it was to be working again. Lorraine did not talk about anything that was on her mind. Clayton, money, the slightly painful lump just over her left pelvic bone. That was most likely just a swollen lymph node left over. She was not going to worry about it. The stress acid that flooded through her arms and legs could run out into the sand and seep away today. Every day. No more useless worry. She told Clary a funny story about the spectacled kid at one house she was cleaning who came racing home early to tell her how amazing it was to find his clothes in the right drawers for a change. His system made sense to me, she said. He's a neat kid. Tidy, I mean, but the rest of his family, wow. I just start at one end of the house and I do what I can. His room was a little sanctuary. Clary listened with one layer of her mind while another breathed in the pear and checked Lorraine carefully for physical clues. She seemed tired but calm. You look great, Clary said again. You look ordinary. I'm so glad. Lorraine nodded. I'm good, she said, not having to work to convince Clary of it. She believed her. Thank you very much for listening. I don't know how much time I've eaten up, but I would be delighted to answer questions if you have any. Oh, you have microphones. Fantastic. You can get into a line. Wonderful. Oh, no, people are bringing mics to you, I guess. Oh, there's a question already. Usually I have a couple of primer questions.
I've read all but the last 19 pages, and you've just given it to me, so, but I had a feeling I knew where it was going. Clary has a terrible self-image. She has no confidence. People tell her she's good, she's obviously good, and in her head she's saying, no, I'm bad, I'm no good. Where is that coming from?
Do you think of yourself as a really good person? I'll
I asked the question first.
I'll answer. I think that she is very hard on herself, but I don't think she's particularly self-aware, you know? I don't think she's really she thinks all the time in a kind of a squirrel wheel way, but I don't think that she's really has any kind of clear vision, even though her name is Clary. That's kind of a joke, because she's not. She grew up with a very, very beautiful and very powerful mother who I don't think she's ever successfully gotten out from under the thumb of. And I know a lot of women who are not unlike this, who for some reason are unable to see themselves truly and see instead all their faults magnified, and they're even to the point of like their crooked nose, and don't see any of their good qualities very clearly. I think it's very sad. But the one nice thing is that a lot of other people do see her beauty and her. One of my favorite things about the book is Trevor's eye on Clary, and how beautiful he finds her and how much he loves her. And that regard of children, I think, is one of the things that saves a lot of us, because we see that our children see us as beautiful, and so we know that we must be. I told you to write these questions down.
Thank you very much. I feel I was surprised when I read your resume that you were an actress. An actor.
Either one is fine.
And I felt at the beginning of the meeting that I had read a very good book. And now I feel like I've just seen an excellent play. Outstanding. And I do have one question. How would you describe the contrast between writing novels versus theater scripts of poetry?
Well, you actually talked about with my stock answer there at the beginning that I wrote plays because people would commission me to write them, but I don't have any kind of a gift for playwriting. And I write poems because every little while it's like I get a cold or a flu and it comes over me and I have to write this poem, and then it goes away again, thank goodness. But there's nothing, to me, I don't know why you're not all writing novels, because there's nothing so deeply pleasurable than being far enough into a novel that it actually has a world of its own that you can live in for a while. And when the people have become people to you rather than just an assortment of names that you might change still, or a plot diagram, when you have somehow invested them in however our imaginations work, you have given them enough reality that they have to do things, that there's no way that Lorraine could move back into Clary's, that they have a logic and an eternal drive that you can't get away from, and yet you get to keep on living with them and letting them carry on. The only problem with a novel really is finishing it. This one, my heart sank a little when I heard that your mandate for the reading is that it be of a manageable size. Because my next book is 530 pages instead of 350, because I just couldn't stop. It was more interesting. There's a question back there.
I like your comment that the hardest thing is finishing writing it, because I think the hardest thing about reading a book, including this book, is finishing reading it. And I loved the book.
Thank you.
So it just pops into my head. Any thoughts to a sequel?
Not for this one. It's funny because I can go on imagining them, but I think you can too. You can figure out what you think. I could tell you my secret thoughts of what I think is going to happen later on for all of them, and whether I think Lorraine will survive, and whether who will end up with the kids and stuff. But I think the reason that you do stop a book is because you come to the end of what needs to be the book, and the rest of it is left for the reader to dream on with, or for, it has fulfilled itself in some way. I can't really imagine writing a sequel with these guys. I could imagine writing a book about Dolly when she's older. I could imagine that, because would be, am I doing something there? Because it would be far enough in the future that it would be a new book, and our lives continue to be interesting and tortured and full of friction, no matter how long we carry on. but it's really nice to have you ask if there could be a sequel. And in fact, I have a secret sequel in the book that I just finished. It's out in Canada, which is about the sisters in vaudeville. I do have a secret sequel in mind because the sisters have children, and so I have this sort of hidden folder somewhere on my computer about what happens when the tiny children become adults in vaudeville. Don't tell anybody.
I always wondered about people who write books, whether you start out with just an idea and then it just kind of flows, or did you know where the whole book was going to go? Did you kind of have it mapped out in your head before time, or do characters develop along the way and then it becomes a book? Or was it?
I think the answer is yes. In my own practice, I do know the beginning, and I do usually know what the end is. I knew, for example, right from the very beginning of Beyond, the short story part that I talked about, I knew as soon as I started writing it as a novel that it would end up at the river in a picnic on Ascension Day. I grew up, my father was an Episcopalian priest, and I grew up sort of doused in religious symbolism, and if you go through that chapter, it's all Ascension Day stuff. It's all, everything that happens at the river is all kind of all this, which nobody else in the world would ever know. But it was in my mind as a reward for myself and a reward for everybody that there'd be this picnic at the end. I also feel, and this is probably crazy, but I do feel that there's a certain responsibility to write comedy rather than tragedy. And Northrop Frye says the difference between a comedy and a tragedy is that a comedy ends with a feast and a tragedy ends with a death. I think there's an awful lot of literary tragedy and a lot of sad, woeful, miserable kind of endings in literature. And I feel as if my mission in literature is to write good endings and make people, because my experience of life has been that actually things get a bit better. That it will be all right in the end. And if it's not all right, it's probably not the end. And so I did know that there was going to be a feast at the end and that would be the feast. And I have known in all of my books what the last bit would be. But I didn't know who would be there. I didn't know whether Lorraine would be there, for example, or whether Clayton would show up, or whether I didn't even know Darwin existed when I started working on the book. Did I see a hand over there somewhere? Oh, we've got Leo in.
Has your father read the book, and what does he think of it?
I was quite worried about that actually. My mother read the book first, and I was pretty sure that she would love it, and she did absolutely love it. My father had not really much liked my first book, and so I was a bit worried about this one, and particularly because it deals with religion, and that's his stomping ground. And I didn't think that he would really agree with my ideas in the book, and I was so touched. He loved it, and he read it, finished reading it on a Sunday when he was staying with me, and he, of course, is a very devout Christian and always goes to church on Sunday, except when they're at my house, we don't tend to go because we don't have a church that we go to. And so he finished the book and he came and said, well, I feel as if I have been to church this morning. I was very touched. It was a very good thing for him to say. And I was very happy that he was able to be as open-minded as he was. And I have to say that neither one of them really liked my vaudeville book that much because it's full of sex. Not really, but it's a little bit more racy than this one. There was a hand up there, all the way up the aisle.
Two of my favorite passages were the one you read with Darwin and Paul at the bar, so I'm glad you read that. And the other one was Paul's Christmas party where they brought in the cake and spilled it. The little boy was eating off the floor. I thought they both felt really true to life and showed people in sort of the best aspect. The one woman had been real grumpy at the church, but she doesn't get worried about her dress getting messed up.
I know. She said it's an excuse to go shopping, Carl.
Yeah, that whole passage just had me laughing out loud.
Yeah, that's great.
So I had a real trivial question for you.
I love trivia questions.
Early on in the book, a man comes into the church, a drunk, and the
Yes.
priest takes him off. And so I thought it had something to do with the book, and couldn't quite figure out how, and we debated it at book club, and everyone else thought it was sort of a throwaway. I'd like to get your aspect on that.
Very good hook. Nobody's ever asked me about that. It is, to me, it is totally central to the book, actually, in this sort of secret underneath structure that people don't often see, and you are really the first person who's ever asked me about it. Stop me if I start sounding stupid, okay? Just start waving your hands, going like this. Okay, so there are doppelgangers in the book. Everybody has a double. And that guy in the church is Darwin. Except it isn't. Except it might be. And Clary thinks it's Darwin. When she's in the hospital and she gets introduced to Darwin, she thinks he was this drunk guy in church, and she treats him with a certain kind of disdain. Have you got microphones that are pointing this way, maybe? Can you point them that way? That might help. Okay. So Clary treats him with, as if he's a drunk. Treats Darwin that way. And then she's ashamed because she realizes, oh, it couldn't be him because it wouldn't be him. But it's never actually said that it isn't him. He never says it's not him. He just says, oh, that's funny, me in church. Or, no, Lorraine says it's funny, it's me in church. There are doubles in the whole, there's people repeating. So everybody has this kind of doppelganger. And in the book, Dolly has Anne, the other girl who doesn't have as happy a time or isn't as lucky. The old man in the bookstore, and there's an old man at the skating rink. Are they the same man? You're not quite sure whether they are or not. I was kind of, it's a long process, a novel. Trying to get yourself to keep on working on it. You weave in things that are kind of a secret life of the book. And in my secret life of the book, I was thinking about how we appear in the world and how we are in our souls, how we are sometimes used by God for whatever God is, for these mysterious purposes, and how we're sometimes just people stumbling along. So I'm really happy to notice that, to hear that you noticed that, and I'm happy to inarticulately try and explain what I was attempting to do. At one point in the early draft, I actually had it very clear that was Darwin, and my husband talked me out of it, and I think it was a very good edit. That it's not clear, you don't know for sure he is, because then what I hope you're left with is that the slight feeling of a taint about Darwin, that even though he seems so nice and he does such nice things, that he might have been that drunk guy in the church. He might be completely unfit for Clary to take into her house. He might be somebody who's not going to be good for the kids or for Lorraine. I just wanted there to, so because he's not necessarily the guy, you get to think about Darwin as a good guy. But I think you have a little subconscious thinking that maybe he's not as good as he seems to be. Thank you. Any other ones? Was that somebody saying a question or somebody sneezing out in the hall, I think? One more? We've got one more in the middle there. I never ask questions at these things. I am so shy about asking questions. I'm very proud of you all for being so brave.
This isn't a question, it's just a comment. One of my very favorite scenes in the book is when Dolly and her friend, I think it's Anne, when they sneak downtown and they're racing to catch the bus, and they get on the bus and they don't realize they have any money.
Yeah.
And Dolly is confident that they look rich enough so that they can get away with it.
Yeah.
I thought that was, Dolly was really class conscious in a way that Clary certainly isn't.
Yeah. I think that when children, we are conscious of a whole bunch of gradations, that we lose the consciousness as we work our way above them. As we get some more power in the world when we're no longer children, we don't have to worry about that. But I remember being very, very conscious of whether I'd be able to get away with things, how honest I had to be. I think I think a lot of us remember. In fact, I quite often have women come up to me, and it's always women, of course, after readings or at book clubs in tears about the time when Dolly is sneaking into the houses. And she's snuck into the Bunts' house, and that's okay, but it's the one where she sneaks into Mrs. Zenko's house, and she gets caught. Now, I never thought that that was a really dangerous moment. I always thought that was kind of just a really nice moment where Mrs. Zenko's sweet to her. But over and over again, I've had women come up and say that I was terrified, my heart was pounding, I'm crying now as I tell you about it. I remember that, I don't know what event from their own childhoods, but there was something about the being caught and expecting, I think that these people who are reading it and moved by it are expecting what kindness is between Mrs. Zenko and Dolly to be broken. And it's not broken, because Mrs. Zenko says, you come in here anytime you want to. This is your house too. And they're overcome by that freedom and safety, I think. It's neat. It's such a weird thing to write stuff sitting alone in your basement, wondering if this scene will work, and then have many years later somebody come up to you and say, I was crying, that was so upsetting, it's so real to me. You know, it's a very lovely thing that happens between writers and readers, where I'm whispering into the page, and then years later the page whispers to you, and you are hearing it and whispering back. It's lovely, I love it. Shall we call it a night? Thank you very much.